Good morning. It is really a pleasure. Our speaker and I were back there. I was told to come on out, and we got to chatting. And I think you're going to be just as enamored of his discussion as I have been. My name's April Mason, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the Provost and Senior Vice President here at Kansas State University, and I welcome you all to the 176th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. And many of you know, but we may have some first-timers in the audience, that this public lecture began in 1966, and it was begun by the then Kansas State University President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring prominent thought leaders to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of our day. And I think you are very clear that we have done just that today. We're very pleased to welcome Mr. Martin Barron to the Landon podium to join 175 previous speakers on bringing their thoughts, their opinions, and their ideas on important public issues. Before I formally introduce our guest, I'd like to introduce a number of leaders that are in attendance today. Would each of these individuals stand when I introduce them? I ask if we could hold our applause until all have been introduced. Dr. Jackie Hartman, Chair of the Landon Lecture Series and Chief of Staff in the Office of the President. Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, Chair of the Landon Patrons. Dr. Andrew Bennett, President of the Faculty Senate and Professor and Chair in the Department of Mathematics. Carol Marden, President of University Support Staff. Jessica Van Rankin, Kansas State University Student Body President for a few more days or weeks, and Senior in Political Science. Trenton Kennedy, Kansas State University Student Body Vice President and Senior in Entrepreneurship, and Jack Ayers, a junior in chemical engineering and pre-medical student. Would you help me in acknowledging these leaders of our campus? I would also like to introduce the following distinguished guests that are here with us today. Regent Dennis Mullen from our Board of Regents lives here in the area, and someone who probably needs no introduction, but let me do so anyway, Senator Nancy Kassebaum Baker. Would you please stand? Thank you, Regent Mullen and Senator Baker, for being here with us. Now our speaker, Martin Barron, introduced to me as Marty. Martin Barron became the executive editor of the Washington Post on January 2nd, 2013. In addition to his leadership at the Washington Post, he has led newsrooms at the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Miami Herald. 11 Pulitzer Prizes have been awarded under his leadership. The Washington Post has won Pulitzers for national reporting, explanatory reporting, and public service, which included coverage of the National Security Agency's surveillance. During his leadership as the editor of the Boston Globe, the publication received 6 Pulitzer Prizes for public service, explanatory journalism, national reporting, and criticism. The Pulitzer Prize for public service was awarded, if I can keep my papers straight here, to the Boston Globe in 2003 for its investigation of concealing clergy sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And this inspired the 2015 movie Spotlight. He was telling us a little bit about how it is to see yourself portrayed on the large screen. He also said it was an older movie now and you could get it for free on Netflix. A year after Martin Barron became executive editor at the Miami Herald, the paper won a 2001 Pulitzer for the coverage of the immigration and international custody dispute of Elián González from Cuba. Doesn't seem like it's been that long since that issue. The National Press Foundation named Barron Editor of the Year in 2004, and Editor and Publisher magazine named him Editor of the Year in 2001. He started his career as a state reporter at the Miami Herald in 1979 after graduating from Lehigh University with a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master's of Business Administration. In his current position at the Post, he oversees print and digital news and manages nearly 700 journalists. He shared with me as we were about to come out that he wished he could stay a little bit longer at Kansas State University, but he needs to fly to New York because 2 of his staff will be receiving prestigious awards this evening. Would you help me in welcoming to the Landon Lecture stage, Mr. Martin Barron.
Thank you very much, Provost Mason, for that warm introduction, and thank you to all of you for inviting me here to Kansas State, and a special thanks to Senator Cassabaum-Baker for being here. It's a real honor to have you here. I very much appreciate it. I'm going to get right into it. I'd like to begin by discussing a statement by the President of the United States. Why waste time? In February, the President declared that people like me were the enemy of the American people. Not just me, of course, but the major mainstream media overall, or the fake news media, as he likes to call us. Those of us who work as journalists had already endured many months of disparagement over the course of a vitriolic and volatile presidential campaign. And then, for good measure, we were subjected to more of that during the transition. We were called scum, disgusting, garbage, the most dishonest human beings on earth, the lowest form of humanity, and because that wasn't enough, the lowest form of life. Those denunciations of the press provoked thousands of people to send nasty, bigoted, misogynistic, and threatening emails and tweets to journalists, some of whom then required extra security. At rallies, thousands heard the media demonized, effectively granting permission for reporters to be verbally harassed, which they were. By the time of the inauguration, I thought the language for attacking, discrediting, marginalizing, delegitimizing, and even dehumanizing the American press had been exhausted. But these days, you just can't predict. And the vocabulary of vilification was subsequently stretched even further. And so the citizens of this country were told that we who work in this profession were enemies of the American people. When the President made that statement, I had some immediate thoughts. Like so many of my professional colleagues, I thought first of the journalists who had risked their lives to inform the American public. Journalists who were eyewitnesses to the world's most dangerous conflicts. I thought of the journalists who didn't just risk their lives, but lost them. And most immediately, I thought of May 9th, 2003, when I, as editor of the Boston Globe, had to inform our newsroom of the death of Elizabeth Newfer. She was 46. Elizabeth had died covering the war in Iraq. Her driver was moving at a high speed, a necessity when there was heightened risk of abductions. The driver lost control. Elizabeth was killed. So was her translator, Walid Khalifa Hassan al-Dulami, 31. As a journalist, she had been fearless in investigating war crimes and human rights abuses. Her Globe reporting overseas led to a much-honored book, The Key to My Neighbor's House, Seeking Justice in Bosnia and Rwanda. As one human rights activist said at the time, she had literally knocked on the doors of a couple of indicted war criminals that people had said could not be found. They were there. Elizabeth found them. She also covered the first Gulf War, the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the war on terrorism in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere. Retired Army Major General William Nash came to know Elizabeth while he was commander of U.S. Army forces in Bosnia. After her death, he said, "She educated me, both in her writings and in her questions, as to the issues of human rights and war crimes in the Bosnia War." She left behind her brother, as well as her longtime companion, Peter Canellis, then the Globe's Washington bureau chief. On October 1 of that year, I, along with other journalists and some officials of the George W. Bush administration, gathered at Gathland State Park in Maryland. There, 4 journalists became the first to be honored at a national monument since it was dedicated in 1896 to the writers and artists who covered the Civil War. Civil War battlefields are nearby. 4 reporters were honored: Daniel Pearl of the Wall Street Journal, Michael Kelly of the Washington Post and the Atlantic Monthly, David Bloom of NBC News, and Elizabeth. Daniel Pearl was kidnapped and murdered in Pakistan, his throat cut by a senior al-Qaeda operative, and his body dismembered. The others died that spring covering the conflict in Iraq. I was invited to speak at the ceremony on behalf of Elizabeth and journalists like her. They remind us of our mission as journalists, I said, and American democracy is nothing without them. For all the burdens they bear, the risks they take, and for all the difficulties they face overseas, they give us in return the ingredients that sustain a free society. Their coffins may not be draped in the American flag, but they are draped in America's highest ideals. We owe it to ourselves as journalists, I said, and we owe it to Elizabeth to state clearly and without fear of boasting that such work, her work, the reporter gathering information with determination and honesty and empathy, the hard and often unpopular business of truth-telling, is not just a job, but a vital and virtuous enterprise. And today, let me add, Elizabeth and the other journalists honored that day were no enemies of the American people, nor were the many other American journalists who have died covering conflicts overseas, nor are the journalists who cover your local and state government, the police, the school board, the city council and county commission, the mayor, the governor, the legislature, the courts. They spend hours attending tedious meetings you won't, and poring over documents dense enough to cure insomnia, to let you know what is happening in your state and in your community. Nor are the journalists who work tirelessly to cover our national government, the policymakers and politicians, including the individual who holds the most powerful position in this country and the world. I recently met the owner and publisher of the newspaper in Benson, Minnesota, population 3,240. His name is Reed Anfinson, and he told me about covering a recent Benson City Council meeting. The conference call was conducted with a consultant in Minneapolis, 120 miles away. The city manager introduced the people in the room: council members, mayor, city staff. And then, Reed said, looking across 4 empty rows of chairs, he said, and the newspaper representing the people of Benson. Reed, owner and publisher, was also the reporter there that day, keeping tabs on local government. Now, that story is not uncommon in thousands of small towns, but it's also not wildly far off from what happens in government meetings and court proceedings that take place in bigger towns and cities, where often only one reporter shows up in a room routinely empty of ordinary citizens. Who tracks our government closely but for the press? And even that now is in doubt. In many states, the largest newspaper may have only one person covering the entirety of state government: the governor, both houses of the legislature, numerous state agencies. The most recent data I've seen showed that 27 states had no reporters in Washington covering their congressional delegations. The labor of the journalists who do this sort of work is in service of their fellow Americans, in service of every citizen's right and duty to understand the community and country we inhabit, and to understand the broader world over which our nation wields profound influence, even in matters of life and death. By the way, that October 2003 ceremony in honor of journalists killed covering war was supposed to revive use of the National War Correspondents' Memorial. The monument was built by George Alfred Townsend, the youngest correspondent to cover the Civil War, the first conflict to be covered extensively by independent reporters. Finally, journalists were to be honored again. In preparation for this talk, I checked to see if anyone followed through on that noble idea of regularly honoring journalists who serve their country by keeping its citizens informed, losing their lives as eyewitnesses at scenes of war. The answer is no. Those 4 war correspondents were the last to be honored. No names have been added to the monument. Why do I tell you this story? Because as we can conclude from the names that remain unetched on that national monument, the contributions of journalists so routinely go unrecorded, unremembered, unappreciated. That should not continue. And journalists like myself, who have the honor of calling hardworking, talented, dedicated, and brave journalists their colleagues, have an obligation to speak up on their behalf. Now, the President ultimately modified his comments about enemies of the American people to say that not all of us were, that there are some great reporters, and to profess his affection for the First Amendment. But it is hard, if not impossible, to rescind a message so searing, one so clearly intended to savage those in the press who were not seeking his favor, weren't carrying his water, and might well contradict him. And the President's tactic appears to have been effective with his base. Republican voters agree by a stunning 81% to 17% that certain news organizations are the enemy of the American people, according to a recent Quinnipiac poll. Now, fortunately, most Americans disagree, 58% versus 39% who agree. Democratic voters are in overwhelming disagreement. Independent voters disagree by 60% to 38%. And fortunately, 89% of American voters still believe it is very important, or somewhat important, for the news media to hold public officials accountable. We can be grateful for that, because that's what we fully intend to do. Take a water break if I can find one. I got it. I needed the water, sorry. It disappeared on me. I wasn't pausing for applause, I want to assure you that. One thing that particularly troubles me these days is the picture that's been painted of who the mainstream press is. We're portrayed as an out-of-touch elite, disconnected from the lives and concerns of ordinary Americans. That is a caricature. Caricatures like it have a long history in populist movements. In a recent Washington Post opinion piece, an economist born in and raised in Venezuela and now living in Madrid identified demonization as essential to populism, the sort that the late Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez represented in his country and the sort that we see in our own country today. Populism, wrote Andrés Miguel Rondón, can survive only amid polarization. It works through the unending vilification of a cartoonish enemy. A few months ago, Washington Post columnist Dana Milbank performed a service in writing about some of the people who populate our newsroom at the Washington Post. First, he mentioned Thomas Gibbons Neff, who deployed twice as a Marine to Afghanistan. The second time as a 22-year-old corporal. He led an 8-man infantry team into combat. One of his best friends later died in combat. He went to Georgetown University on the GI Bill. He joined the Post 2 years ago and covers the Pentagon. Dana also cited Lori Montgomery, our deputy national editor. She was raised on a dairy farm in western Pennsylvania. Her brother still runs the farm. And he mentioned Jose Del Real, a political reporter. He was born in Central California to immigrant farmhands from Mexico. His mother worked as a maid, his father as a cook and dishwasher. He graduated from Harvard. Dan Egan, a political editor, is the son of a Lutheran minister from small-town Minnesota. I would also mention Tracy Grant, a deputy managing editor who oversees our hiring and career development. She is the daughter of Irish immigrants who came to Chicago with only $200. Her father worked first as a hotel waiter, then as a day laborer, laying bricks and worrying that temperatures would plunge and deprive him of work, then took a job filling cans in a soda factory, and then finally got a union job as a helper on a beer truck. As Tracy told me the other day, it was as blue-collar could be. Literally, I would iron his blue shirts. He was an incredibly smart man, she said, who read voraciously and would have loved college if he had had a chance to go. I think a lot about my mom and dad when I read some of the stories about families in Middle America. My parents made a life for themselves and their daughters against odds that many people are facing today. But the jobs that my dad did are largely jobs that are going away. I got to go to college because of an immigrant's determination and an economy that valued hard work. But I am never far removed from the days when the weather might be too cold for him to bring home a paycheck. It engenders an empathy I wouldn't trade for anything, and for which I will be eternally grateful to my parents. We continue to hire with the objective of bringing on board talented individuals with varied life experiences. A recent hire of ours joined the Marines after graduating from Notre Dame, and then served as an infantry officer, deploying twice to Helmand Province, Afghanistan. He then decided to attend Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. Another recent hire is the oldest of 11 kids, was homeschooled, and graduated from Wheaton College, which is rooted in evangelical Christianity. These people who work for us are not elitists. No matter which multimillionaire or multi-billionaire currently in government would like to stick them with that label. They bring the lessons of their lives to our newsroom, where they find meaning in their work. One of our religion reporters, Sarah Pulliam Bailey, also a Wheaton graduate, wrote recently about what drew her to journalism. Her commentary came immediately after a presidential campaign that became fertile ground for conspiracy theories, one of which motivated an armed gunman to walk into a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor and fire a few shots. As a reporter who also happens to be Christian, she wrote, "I believe that truth exists and can be ascertained, even if imperfectly, and the fact that we understand it imperfectly heightens our duty to pursue it diligently. And I believe journalism is one of the best practical pursuits of truth in earthly life, one that allows us to reveal and explain the truth to others. Many religions seek a truth that is beyond the scope of journalism. Yet if people of faith no longer accept the veracity of factual truth, then they threaten to undermine their own pursuit of ultimate questions." I am proud that those who populate our newsroom have lived varied lives, are informed by different experiences, and bring distinct perspectives. We must do even better at diversifying our newsrooms. The late journalist Gwen Ifill once said, "We have stories to tell, but many in our audience have stopped listening because they can tell that we're not talking about them." This is true of too many people: African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Middle Americans, working class Americans. I could go on. We have a diverse and complex country. It is a challenge to reflect the perspectives of all its people. But we who run newsrooms have an obligation to work on it. Whatever our backgrounds, there is much that unites us as journalists. Based on 40 years in the profession, here is what I would list as the beliefs we share. We believe in free expression. We believe that includes a free, vigorous, and independent press. We believe the press should hold powerful institutions and powerful individuals accountable, no one more so than the President of the United States. We believe wrongdoing and abuse of power should be exposed. We believe in open, honest, and honorable government that respects and upholds democratic, small d, norms. We believe in civil rights, and we believe in civility. We believe in acceptance for all people, and we believe all people deserve dignity and respect. We believe in a societal obligation to help the least fortunate among us. We believe evidence and expertise and experience should be highly valued, not ignored or dismissed or denied. We believe there is such a thing as fact. We believe there is such a thing as truth. And we don't take well to being lied to. The seeds of conflict with politicians, not just those today, but in any era, can be found in those beliefs. Conflict between the press and the presidency is not new to this administration. An adversarial relationship has been a constant from one administration to the next. One of my predecessors as executive editor of the Washington Post, Landon, released a report more than 3 years ago on behalf of the Committee to Protect Journalists. It excoriated then-President Obama for an erosion of press freedoms and government transparency. And the language of that report may surprise you. It begins like this. In the Obama administration's Washington, government officials are increasingly afraid to talk to the press. Those suspected of discussing with reporters anything that the government has classified as secret are subject to investigation, including lie detector tests and scrutiny of their telephone and email records. An insider threat program being implemented in every government department requires all federal employees to help prevent unauthorized disclosures of information by monitoring the behavior of their colleagues. It continued, despite President Barack Obama's repeated promise that his administration would be the most open and transparent in American history, reporters and government transparency advocates said they are disappointed by its performance in improving access to the information they need. And the report quoted David Sanger, a veteran Washington correspondent for the New York Times, as declaring, "This is the most closed, control-freak administration I've ever covered." A look back at the Clinton administration also offers some lessons. When Donald Trump, in the final weeks of his campaign, was under siege from nearly a dozen women accusing him of having sexually forced himself on them, he pronounced it the single greatest pile-on in history. Well, maybe not. Anyone with a good and honest memory will recall the pounding that Bill Clinton took for his affairs. They were intensely covered for years, dating to the beginning of his presidential campaign. As Trump sought to fend off charges from his accusers, Politico's Jack Schafer helpfully reminded readers of the January to February 1998 period when Clinton was accused of having an affair with a White House intern, but forcefully denied it. "We don't find a press feeding frenzy," Schafer wrote. "No, it was more like a bloody bacchanalia, as reporters filed their teeth down to dagger points and tore through Clinton's lies and obfuscations until he wearily conceded the affair that August." Why, Schafer asked, didn't the press just take Clinton at his word that he didn't consort with the young intern? Why did reporters pile on? For one thing, his denial was not consistent with the available evidence pointing to an affair. And if there's one thing reporters can't stand, it's being lied to. Today, we have an administration that claims to be especially persecuted by the press. The president's chief strategist has called us the opposition party. The president himself, shortly after inauguration, visited the CIA and chose the occasion to assert that he had a running war with the media. The president may be at war, but the Washington Post is not. We're at work. We're just trying to do our jobs. This is the very job envisioned by this nation's founders, who saw the press as a check on the potential abuse of power. And our independence from the administration is not a hostile act. It is a moral duty and a realization of what the nation's founders envisioned when they wrote the First Amendment. Now, it's easy to appreciate why the administration would like to position the press as its political opponent. As journalist John Cassidy wrote in The New Yorker, the aim is to portray the media as a political adversary rather than an independent monitor, so that when damaging stories appear, the administration can dismiss them. The biggest conflicts with this administration, the ones that have the president calling us enemies of the people, have to do with basic facts. But when we as journalists are confronted with a torrent of falsehoods, we have an absolute obligation to point them out and call them what they are, no matter how creative the administration is in the name-calling it directs at us. No matter whether they label us fake news or the opposition party or garbage or bad people or enemies of the American people, no matter whether the president threatens to sue us or to exclude us, we should not be intimidated. The fundamental task of journalism is to tell the facts as they really are, no matter what. I mentioned toward the start of my talk, the memorial to journalists killed doing their jobs in conflict zones. One of them was Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter brutally executed by al-Qaeda in Pakistan. This past February, his colleague at the Journal, Bret Stephens, gave a lecture named in Daniel Pearl's honor at UCLA. It was a brilliant speech. Bret Stephens is a conservative columnist. As a true journalist, he is committed to facts. And he used the Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture to talk about the need to remain faithful to our profession's fact-telling mission during this administration. I'm going to read at some length from his speech here because he said it so much better than I possibly can. When you work at the Wall Street Journal, Bret Stephens said, the coins of the realm are truth and trust, the latter flowing exclusively from the former. When you read a story in the Journal, you do so with the assurance that immense reportorial and editorial effort has been expended to ensure that what you read is factual. Not probably factual, not partially factual, not alternatively factual. I mean fundamentally, comprehensively, and exclusively factual, and therefore trustworthy. This is how we operate. This is how Danny operated. This is how he died, losing his life in an effort to nail down the story. He continued, "We honor the responsibility to separate truth from falsehood, which is never more important than when powerful people insist that falsehoods are truths, or that there is no such thing as truth to begin with." So that's the business we're in, the business of journalism. And he concluded, "We each have our obligation to see what's in front of one's nose, whether we're reporters, columnists, or anything else. This is the essence of intellectual integrity. Not to look around or beyond or away from the facts, but to look straight at them, to recognize and call them for what they are, nothing more or less, to see things as they are before we reinterpret them into what we'd like them to be, to hold fast to a set of intellectual standards and moral convictions that won't waver amid changes of political fashion or tides of unfavorable opinion, to speak the truth irrespective of what it means for our popularity or influence. The legacy of Danny Pearl is that he died for this," Bret Stephens said. "We are being asked to do much less. We have no excuse not to do it." Truth and falsehood are neither conservative nor liberal, neither Republican nor Democrat. So when Donald Trump, well before his candidacy, publicly doubted that President Obama was born in the United States, he was promoting a falsehood. Evidence showed Obama was born here. And finally, late in the presidential campaign, Trump had to acknowledge that. When Donald Trump, as a candidate, asserted that he saw television footage of thousands of Muslims in New Jersey cheering the fall of the World Trade Center towers on 9/11, that was false. There is no such footage, and no newspaper coverage, and no evidence anything like that occurred. The day after the inauguration, when the White House press secretary, acting on the president's instructions, declared this was the largest audience to ever witness the inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe, that was false. And National Park Service photographs proved it. When, as a new president, Trump claimed that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally, and that without that fraud, he would have won the popular vote, that was false. Neither he nor anyone has been able to produce evidence of any pattern of fraud. When the new president said that there were buses carrying people from Massachusetts to New Hampshire to vote illegally during the general election, that was false. there is no evidence of that whatsoever. When the president declared that his predecessor had wiretapped Trump Tower before the election, engaging in McCarthyism and behavior that was equivalent to Nixon Watergate, he had a duty, just as any of us would, to produce evidence. He never did. And judging from the sworn congressional testimony of the FBI director and the National Security Agency chief, he never will, because from everything we know, the allegation was false. The president's press secretary scolded the press for repeatedly insisting that the president provide evidence to back up an extraordinary accusation against President Obama. But the press was obligated to do that. Since when has it been a sin for journalists to demand evidence when someone alleges grave wrongdoing, even a crime? There is a lot of head-scratching material these days in the interactions between the press and the presidency. In February, when the president spoke to the Conservative Political Action Conference, he singled out for criticism a story that happened to be one of ours. It was our disclosure that General Michael Flynn, his national security advisor, had not told the truth when he insisted that he had not held pre-inauguration discussions with Russian officials about sanctions against that country. In fact, he had held such discussions, we reported. He had not told the truth to the American people. He also had not told the truth to the vice president, who, based on Flynn's assurances, publicly dismissed any notion that someone in the administration had discussed sanctions with Russia prior to Trump becoming president. We attributed our story to 9 sources, and we cited intelligence intercepts. And yet the president said, "There are no 9 people. I don't believe there was 1 or 2 people. 9 people." And I said, "Give me a break. They make up sources. They're very dishonest people." That was a perplexing statement. Because the president had just fired General Flynn on grounds that he had not told the vice president the truth about his conversations with the Prussians. His press secretary said at the time, the president was very concerned that General Flynn had misled the vice president and others, and he cited quote, an evolving and eroding level of trust, unquote, with the national security advisor. So if the press secretary is to be believed, then what we reported could not have been made up. And in fact, it was true, which means we really did have sources. And of course we did. On top of that, the president pointed to our story and others in his call for a leak investigation. He repeated that call prior to hearings that featured the FBI director and NSA chief disputing the president's allegations that President Obama had ordered Trump Tower wiretapped. Even as that hearing was getting underway, Trump tweeted, "The real story that Congress, the FBI, and all others should be looking into is the leaking of classified information. Must find leaker now!" exclamation mark. So here's a question. If the president really believes we had no sources for our story, then what exactly does he think needs investigating? By his own reasoning, there would have been no leak. This is head-spinning stuff. And it explains why the conservative editorial page of the Wall Street Journal published an editorial in March entitled "A President's Credibility," pointing to what it described as the president's, quote, seemingly endless stream of exaggerations, evidence-free accusations, implausible denials, and other falsehoods, end quote. The president has also been selective in his denunciations of the press. He hasn't condemned all uses of anonymous sources, nor all purported leaks of classified information. In support of the accusation that Obama had ordered surveillance of Trump Tower, the president's team pointed to news reports that relied on anonymous sources. If true, those stories would have represented a leak of classified information. You did not hear the president attack those leaks. He did not call for a leak investigation, nor did he assert in that instance that the use of anonymous sources meant there were no real sources. There are two possible reasons the president didn't call for a leak investigation on those occasions. One, he never genuinely believed those stories to be true, so no leak investigation would have been warranted. Or two, he is not concerned about leaks of classified information as long as they help him politically. George Will, a conservative columnist for the Washington Post, last January offered this biting assessment of the White House's relationship with facts. What is most alarming, he said, about the president and his accomplices in the dissemination of factoids is not that they do not know this or that, and it is not that they do not know what they do not know. Rather, it is that they do not know what it is to know something. Who could have imagined that we would now see the word epistemology mentioned so often? Epistemology concerns how we know what we know. David Roberts of Vox has pointed to the emergence of what he calls tribal epistemology. Information, he wrote, is evaluated based not on conformity to common standards of evidence or correspondence to a common understanding of the world, but on whether it supports the tribe's values and goals and is vouchsafed by tribal leaders. Good for our side and true begin to blur into one. In polarization between right and left, the great casualty has been the distinction between true and false. Instead of concocting an imaginary enemy of the American people, we would be better served by confronting the profound threat to civil society of having falsehoods and crazy conspiracy theories accepted as truth. Citizens can and should debate how to interpret events. We will form different opinions on how to address the world's many challenges. But how does democracy survive when people cannot agree on a core set of facts? When we cannot agree on what happened even yesterday? Contrary to how the press is so often portrayed, with fake news being the least favorite epithet, unearthing facts is what quality journalists have done for decades, and that has served the public interest. Unearthing facts is what Dana Priest and Ann Hull and photographer Michael DeSeal of the Washington Post did in 2007 when they exposed the mistreatment of wounded veterans at Walter Reed Hospital, sparking public outrage and leading to overdue reforms. That's what the Los Angeles Times did in 2010 when it dug up pervasive corruption in the California city of Bell, where officials had used the city's accounts as their personal piggy bank. Convictions and reforms followed. That's what the Las Vegas Sun did in 2008 when it exposed the high death rate among construction workers on the Las Vegas Strip, where safety regulations were not rigorously enforced. Workers today are better protected as a result. That's what the Times-Picayune of New Orleans and the Biloxi Gulfport Sun-Herald did in 2005 when they provided nonstop coverage of the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, even as their own homes and workplaces were threatened. Their work proved to be a lifeline for the people of their communities. And unearthing facts is what the Boston Globe did in 2002, when it exposed a decades-long policy and practice of concealing clerical sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. The voices of sex abuse survivors were finally heard. A powerful institution was held to account. Reforms followed. and children were made more safe. Who would have done this work but for journalists? Enemies of the American people? I don't think so. Thank you for listening. Yeah, sure.
We have time for some questions, and I am thinking that some people might have some. We have 2 microphones, so if you have questions, if you would come to the microphone, if you would say who you are, and we're going to limit 1 question per person. Thank you.
Mr. Barron, my name is Leonard LeBlanc. I have a simple question, but there's a long story. I'll try to keep it under a minute. I need a simple answer. I have written for Time magazine. I also am a contributor to Story Ideas and Background Military. My supervisor is Mark Thompson, who is a senior military editor and 1985 Pulitzer Prize winner for investigative reporting. He just retired. The question is the Washington Post still interested in a story that one reporter contacted me before? The answer is yes, no, or let me get back to you. I'll try to make this an elevator speech. 2 years ago, a Washington Post reporter contacted me out of the blue, I was in Thailand, and asked me would I be willing to speak with him at length about a federal whistleblower lawsuit that I filed against a corrupt defense contractor in Kuwait called CSA. I'm estimating they stole probably less than $1 billion. I said, sure, absolutely. So I gave him everything I had, contacts, witnesses. We spoke again several times. 2 months later, he got back to me and said, all right, the story's written. Just waiting for Freedom of Press Information Act, a FOIA to come in, and we'll roll with the story. That was 2 years ago. Last September, I contacted the newsroom, and I said, hey, what happened to the story? What happened to the reporter? What happened to the FOIA? The response came back, said, well, we never heard of this guy. We don't know anything about the story, don't know anything about a FOIA, and if we did, you'd have to talk to him directly. It's his story. Next in line. Okay. I also reached out to another Washington Post reporter, a man named Bob Woodward, 3 or 4 times over the past year or 2. And I said, hey, what happened to this reporter? I'm sure this guy sat next to you in the newsroom. What happened? Silence. I filed a FOIA. The response just came back in this past Friday. It's from the Army Criminal Investigation Command. There were 133 investigations done on CSA and another fly-by-night firm called Kellogg Brown & Root, KBR, who I also filed a federal whistleblower lawsuit against. They probably stole less than $100 billion.
Okay, so what is the question? I'm sorry.
The question is, are you interested? And
we're always interested in fraud and abuse. I don't know who the reporter is. I'm not sure that you'd have to tell me who you spoke to. I have no idea.
We'll talk after.
And by the way, Bob Woodward, while he's associated with the Post, he hasn't been a reporter there for a long period of time. He's associate editor. It's kind of an honorific. We work with him from time to time, but he doesn't sit in our newsroom. So the notion that he was somehow sitting next to this reporter, he hasn't actually sat in our newsroom for a very long time. So I'd have to know more detail on what you're talking about. These kinds of investigations on fraud and defense contracting and all of that are incredibly difficult. As you know, the regulations are incredibly complex. There are many instances that I'm aware of where we've spent an enormous amount of time really digging into this stuff, and it's very hard to tell whether there's really been fraud or not. And it can take years of investigation, so it's not easy. But I'd have to know who you even spoke to, and I have no idea who that is. So.
We'll have you follow that up. Thank you. Next question.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, sir. I'm Maggie Stanton. I'm a journalism student. First of all, thank you for coming to speak with us. My question is, the Washington Post has obviously been extensively covering global and political issues, but one of my favorite stories has to do with a story written by Gene Weingarten in 2009, Fatal Distraction, Forgetting a Child in the Backseat of a Car. And so my question to you is, when you're dealing with these these stories that can produce a very visceral emotional reaction, when you're trying to get people to see both sides of the story, how do you go about first investigating and then covering that story? What's the process like?
Well, it's hard to talk about in the abstract. That story you spoke about ran actually before I got to the Post, a little over 4 years ago. Ran in our magazine. Gene wrote about people who leave their kids in the car and they close the windows and then the kids die, sadly, and how common that actually is. It's often portrayed as a sort of deliberate act of murder, but it's not clear that that's the case, that people are incredibly forgetful, and when the kid's in the back, they sometimes forget them. So he really looked at and there are some real cases where people have murdered their kids, but there are a lot of others that's not clear at all. So it's an incredibly complex situation. Look, it's very hard to talk about in the abstract, but obviously he spent a lot of time in that instance with the people involved, talking to you want to talk to people all around the story. So certainly talk to the parents, talk to the people who knew the parents, talk to law enforcement, talk to anybody, look at a lot of cases and see how they are the same and how they are different. These are really tough stories to do. He did that one really well. It helped him win a Pulitzer Prize. It was one of the stories that won him a Pulitzer Prize that particular year. You want to show empathy, but you also want to use your powers of critical analysis at the same time. You need to be skeptical too. The stories like that are among the trickiest we have to do.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. My name is Lamise Maddie, and I guess I just kind of had a quick question about, I normally don't usually say what my beliefs are to a large number of people, because I just personally don't really like doing that, but I myself am Muslim, and I guess I know that there's a lot of talk about radical Islam, blah blah blah, and although that some attacks are true, I guess are the portrayal of Muslims in general. I don't know if it necessarily shows the whole truth, if that makes any sense. And so I was wondering, what can we as journalists do to kind of expose the fact that although there's radical Muslims, that not all Muslims are radicals?
Sure. Well, we actually have a staff member who is full-time dedicated to covering the Muslim community in the United States and the Arab American population. So we're not talking about exactly the same thing there, but there's overlap, obviously. So she's someone who spent a lot of time as a correspondent in the Arab world, most recently in Cairo, and so she's very knowledgeable about that. And one of her jobs is to go out and talk to ordinary Muslims, people who aren't doing anything wrong, who are just trying to live their lives, get ahead like everybody else, raise their kids in a good environment, a healthy environment, and to reflect their lives as well. And we've done many stories along those lines. At the same time, we do have terrorist attacks in the United States. Now, not all terrorist attacks are conducted by Muslims, by the way. There are many terrorist attacks that are conducted by other people. So when you had Dylan Roof walk into a church and blow a bunch of people away in South Carolina, that was a terrorist act as well. So, but we definitely want to explore that world and what that nexus is between those individuals who have been radicalized here in the United States or who entered the United States and how that happened. So I had left Boston by the time of the Boston Marathon bombing, but obviously all of us who were looking into that story wanted to find out how did these two young men who grew up in the United States for the most of their lives, how did they become so radicalized? So we need to explore that as well.
Yeah.
The world is a complex place. I mean, it doesn't lend itself. While the people tend to stick people with a lot of stereotypes, the world, if you really look at it, doesn't lend itself to stereotypes. And one of the things that we want to do is really explore the complexities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's John Blair. You are obviously in a story-rich environment right now between tensions on the international scene and domestic issues that are coming up like a popcorn machine. Are you adequately staffed to handle this many stories of potential import, and how do you then triage those stories, or how do you staff up so that we get the information that we need?
Well, I always say that we're understaffed, and you should write a letter to our owner, Jeff Bezos, to let him know that he should send us a few more dollars. But he's been great as an owner. He's owned us for about 3.5 years. We've grown tremendously. He's invested in our newsroom in a substantial way. We've been able to hire and to experiment in all the ways that we need to do in this era, this digital era that we have. But we've put some additional reporters overseas. We have added people to cover sort of national affairs and politics. Obviously, many of those people are staying on politics. We have more people covering the White House now than we ever have before, just 8 alone for the White House. We also have a team of about 8 whose job is to get out of Washington, go to the rest of the country, spend time in the rest of the country, making sure that we know what the issues are and that we're reflecting them in an accurate way. And then we have a whole staff that's covering Congress and thematic issues that are related, and then the agencies and thematic issues, whether it's the environment or labor or you name the subject. So, or Justice Department, whatever it might be. So we feel pretty good about our staffing at the moment. I would always love to have more people, but this year alone, actually, because we've been successful. Last year we had a successful year. We had our first profitable year in quite some time. Our traffic, we now have digital traffic in the United States that's essentially equivalent to the New York Times. Our subscriptions are surging, so that's all incredibly gratifying. And so we've had a good year, and that money has been reinvested, thanks to our owner, in additional resources. So we're adding 60 people to our newsroom this year. And they're doing different things, but among them is additional 8 people to our investigative unit. Now that's something that we had proposed, I had proposed well before. Some people say, well, that's related to the election and to Trump, but it's not actually. I had made that proposal internally prior to the election, and this team is available to our Metro staff, our business staff, all the staff, and of course they're focusing at the beginning at least on national stories. But what I had said to my publisher at the time is no matter who is elected, we can be sure there's going to be a lot to be investigated. So, and we all agreed on that, so it didn't really matter. So we feel good. We would like more, but ideally, if we have another great year, we'll get some more resources to apply to it. But we feel pretty confident about our ability to cover what we need. On top of that, we have something called the Washington Post Talent Network, which is a freelance network that we have that extends all around the world, around the United States and around the world, includes reporters, photographers, and videographers. And we created that. It's an online system. It's highly efficient. And it's one of a kind, really. It's been called, I don't know whether it's positive or negative, but it's been called the Uber of journalism. So, and so we have over 3,000 people in that network. And if you look at the map of the United States where people are positioned, they're all over this country. So their job is not just to respond to news when it occurs quickly. Let's say if there's another unfortunate mass shooting, to be able to respond to that we have somebody in that location, which we typically do, very nearby. but also to tell us what's happening in other places and make sure that we're aware of stories that we wouldn't otherwise be aware of. And I think that is the highest purpose.
Thank you. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Mr. Barron, first, thanks for coming. My name's Ned Seaton. I'm a journalist like you. There are actually a lot of us in the audience. And congratulations for all your honors and for making a profit also.
Yeah, we were happy. We were happy.
Yeah.
Better than not.
I bet.
You know, when I was at the Boston Globe, they used to say, wouldn't it be better, you know, we were worried about all the cuts, and they would say, wouldn't it be better if we were a nonprofit? I said, we are.
Yeah,
Just not voluntarily.
Right.
So
we're all working on it, right. Well, one of the more disheartening aspects of the job that we do is the item that you touched on towards the end, the sort of tribal nature of truth. I remember hearing after President Trump said that he, in fact, had ended the controversy over whether President Obama had been born in the United States, and in fact that Hillary Clinton had started that controversy.
yeah, I didn't mention that one. I had a list. My list was long enough.
Yeah,
so.
well, the polls showed that strong numbers of people believed that to be true.
Right.
And I guess my question to you is, do people really care about the truth? And what should we do about that? Doing our jobs every day as journalists is sort of all that I think we can do, but that does not seem to be good enough. What else do we do as an industry, or for that matter, as a country?
It's a tough question. I mean, I think people do care about the truth. They just don't agree on what the truth happens to be and what our basic facts are. And it's become ever more difficult with the internet and the ability of people to go to a source of information that reinforces their pre-existing point of view. And it doesn't just reinforce their pre-existing point of view. It, in some instances, delivers to them, quote, facts that fit into that worldview that they have, and so they're much more likely to be credulous than they would be otherwise. And those facts are not facts; they're actually fiction. You know, so it's a huge challenge these days. You know, I think there's a lot. There's some things that can be done. I wish I had all the answers to these challenges that we face. I do think that there needs to be more news literacy education in the schools. There are the beginnings of some programs, one of which I'm involved with, that is beginning to get funding, and they're beginning to scale across the country, which I think is really important to help students in high schools really try to distinguish, you know, or ask critical questions is what they really ought to do. The other thing that I think we can do is to be more transparent about how we go about our work. To show the documents that we're looking at, to make clear who we've actually interviewed, to give a sense inside what our process is, because it can be such a mystery to people. One of the great successes we had over the last year was Dave Farenthold, who was looking at the charitable foundation, the Donald J. Trump Charitable Foundation, and Trump's charitable activities or non-activities. So, and what he did is he actually did this investigation essentially on Twitter. He was asking people to help him. Tell me another organization I should be looking at, and they participated in the process. You know, people in the public helped find the portraits of Donald Trump that were acquired with foundation funds. It's stuff like that. And so I think that we can be more open. I heard a line the other day that transparency is the new objectivity. That's kind of a cool line. So I thought I'd test market it here. Didn't work out so well. You should have laughed the first time I said it, not the second time. But I do think that we need to be more open about what our process is. And there's some stuff happening along those lines. Google is involved in that. They are helping to back something called a trust project, and part of that is to help sort out what's, you know, who's reliable and who's not reliable, and part of that is, you know, who wrote the story? Can the person who wrote the story be contacted? Is the person who wrote the story actually close to the action? You know, maybe you should give more credibility to a smaller newspaper that is actually right there in the town where this thing is happening, and also to give background on who the writers are, to talk about what their experience is and where they have expertise in certain areas, and also to provide more documentation, sort of kind of like footnotes would be. And we can do that more easily now, somewhat more easily now, because you can do annotations online, and we use an annotation tool called Genius. It was created to annotate rap. We use it to annotate news stories, and so we can provide extra information. So when we cite a fact, we can then provide sort of the background for that fact. And I think that those are that's the direction that we probably have to move, is in greater transparency.
Thank you.
We could go on for a very long time. I'm going to honor the two people who have been standing, and that will conclude our questions. Please.
Okay. My name's Blake Carell. I am a student in philosophy and also an improviser on the spot Kansas State. Yeah. There's another one here.
And improvise. What was the
improviser? So it's an improv comedy troupe here at
Oh,
Kansas
I
State.
see. Okay.
That's
great.
partially what motivates this question.
Right.
So you talked a lot about the discourse with the American public, with the press, providing facts to the American people, and I was wondering what sort of importance maybe a comedic portrayal of those things like in SNL could be to the discourse, since it is biased. It doesn't necessarily hinge on facts. So I was wondering what you might want to say about that.
Sure. I mean, those have been, I mean, it's been amazing. I mean, I think more or less of SNL than I do think of John Oliver now. Obviously, he's approaching things from a left point of view, to say the least. So, but there's a lot of reporting that goes on into those programs. And that and Jon Stewart, when he was doing his thing, really pointed up a lot of contradictions and hypocrisy and all of that, and they actually have reporters on their staff who dig up all this information. And John Oliver, when he did a shout out for people to support journalism, for which we were very grateful, he said, I couldn't do my show without legitimate journalists. I wouldn't know what was going on. And as it turns out, he has several former reporters for the nonprofit investigative outfit called ProPublica, I think, working for him. And so I think they can be very helpful. Now, you have to realize, obviously, those are coming with a distinct point of view, but I don't think anybody's under an illusion that that's an objective presentation of facts. But they do, I think they serve an important purpose, as satire and as satire always has for a long time.
Thank you.
And our last question.
I'm Mary Bridges. I serve as chaplain at Presbyterian Manor in Salina. My question is, we spend a lot of time in the church and in the religious community debating and arguing the Shack, the movie. You know, some people are offended by it, not realizing it's not a biblical story. I would like to know how people who serve other people can help them learn fact and fiction. You talked about educating our youth. I think that's awesome. But so many people in my generation who are not really all that literate on social media, we don't know if it's fact or fiction. How do I find information to help educate people so we know what we're reading?
Look, I mean, it's hard because on social media, people can, what you get in your news feed, it comes to you via an algorithm. It's basically, who are you friends with? What are they reading? What interests, what have you clicked on before? What does that indicate about you? And so whatever you like and whatever your friends like, you get more of that and you get less of the other stuff. So you don't really see different points of view. Facebook has been sharply criticized for its role in spreading misinformation through a system like that. They now have a fair number of people working on this issue. I would say that the progress so far has been, let's just say, nascent. It's at the early stages. Google, as I mentioned, has this trust project that they're trying to work on. I think that people are going to have to bear the responsibility largely themselves. All right, and I was asked not too long ago, how do you judge what to trust and what not to trust? And that's a very difficult question to answer. And I would say that if you have a news source that only presents things that appeal to your point of view, and that there's never anything there that contradicts it, There isn't an opinion piece, there isn't a news story, there isn't anything. There's nothing that would challenge you ever. It just constantly reinforces your point of view. That is a news source that's trying to pander to you. That's not a news source that's trying to provide you objective information. I mean, look, at the Washington Post, for all the criticism that we take, you know, we have incredible number of conservative columnists. You know, I mean, we have Charles Krauthammer, we have George Will, we have, you know, a bunch of others who are there, and we've brought on others to, you know, to find some people who are sort of more in line with the Trump point of view, to the extent that we can divine what that exactly is. So, and we're working on that. We're staying flexible, just like him. So, so we have that, and then and there are stories that get Democrats really upset. You know, it's not as if the Democrats haven't been upset with us. They're incredibly upset with us. I mean, I was under sharp criticism for our coverage of the emails that were extracted, probably by almost seemingly by the Russians, from her campaign chairman and the DNC and all of that. People said we shouldn't even have covered those things because they were illegally obtained, and there was clearly an effort to discredit her and all of this sort of stuff. And they were very upset with the coverage of that. And the Obama administration's been upset with us for a long time. I mean, you think that we have regular interviews with Obama when he was in office? I don't think I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. I don't think he gave us an interview to the Washington Post one-on-one since his second year in office. For the last 2 years that he was in office, we were asking constantly for an interview with him, and he turned us down every single time. And so, you know, there was no love lost there. They were constantly haranguing us about one thing or another. And stories that, look, when we covered the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, AKA Obamacare, it was a disaster. I mean, it was a total disaster. And we wrote story after story about what a disaster it was and why it should never have happened in the first place if they had done their jobs properly. And they were furious with us about that coverage. And that's great. They should be, that's fine if we upset them. We are doing our jobs by holding government accountable, whoever's in that office accountable, and we should be holding, you know, state government and local government and every form of government and other powerful institutions accountable. And if people are upset with us from time to time, which they seem to be, that's okay if it's for the right reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I knew we were in for a treat. I wish we could go on with questions, but we do have some time constraints. But I want to thank all of you for being here, and thank you for showing our guest, our Landon lecturer today, such a warm welcome. Thank you so much.